Hello, and welcome to our video on using Greek and Latin tree banks for research within the field of classical studies. I'm Bob Gorman, and this video serves as a kind of introduction to one of the topics that we'll be covering at the workshop sponsored by the Perseus Project. And this workshop will be held this coming January 4th and 5th in Toronto, where it coincides, more or less, with the annual meeting of the Society for Classical Studies. The workshop, as you see from the slide, is to be held at the Weston Harbour Castle in Toronto. Now, the subject of this particular video is tree banks and research. In other videos we discuss other topics, tree banks and pedagogy and so forth, but here it's research that is of interest. Now, it's not surprising to find dependency tree banks of Greek and Latin used in research, and the first thing we think about, perhaps, is the growing field of corpus linguistics. Corpus linguistics essentially relies on linguistic databases to test and form and transform various theories about linguistic phenomena. And indeed, the existing tree banks of Latin and Greek have been used in this linguistic endeavor. And so we'll find articles that refer more or less extensively to data drawn from Latin and Greek dependency tree banks. Well, I find this linguistic research very interesting and can be very illuminating when one is trying to understand or teach various aspects of Latin or Greek, but that's not what I want to talk about today. Although we, of course, encourage anybody who's interested in developing skills in tree banking for purposes of grammatical linguistic study to attend the workshop if they can. It is free and open. So I'm not at all dismissing this kind of research, but in this video, I want to talk about the research being conducted by my colleague Vanessa Gorman and I, because I want to point out how this kind of resource, that is the tree banks, can be used for help in answering questions that are literary, or in our case, historiographical in nature, and not purely linguistic. Now, Vanessa and I have been working for quite a few years on a research question which comes down to how, or even whether, we can determine the accuracy of fragments, of historical fragments, that is, essentially text reuse in the form of quotations by later classical authors of earlier classical authors. And our research question is, can we make some kind of systematic evaluation of the reliability of these fragments as historical evidence? Now, we focused in particular on one transmitter of these fragments, one author, and that's the very well-known Athenaeus, who wrote a very lengthy work around 200 of the current era, in which he preserves, as it says on your slide, a large number of quotations, paraphrases, etc., from a large number of authors. And what's very interesting to us, in fact very important, is that he names these authors and frequently the works written by the authors. So we have the very unusual circumstance of having a large collection of instances of text reuse, each associated with the name of the person who wrote them. So, given that situation, how can we make any kind of intelligent statements about the reliability of these fragments, especially in the cases, and these are the ones we're really interested in, when no non-fragmentary evidence about the author exists. That is, how do we evaluate whether we think, well, what can be said about the style, for example, being used in a quotation when none of the parallel material by the same author is directly transmitted, but all of it comes as a quotation from one source or another. And we've been working on this issue, and we've made some progress. And one of the things we've noticed is that in Athenaeus and other places, but particularly in Athenaeus, there seems to be a kind of pattern of the sentence, the way the sentences are formed. Kind of a syntactic pattern seems to repeat in many fragments. And so we've asked ourselves, can anything be done? Can we base any kind of insights on what seems to be this kind of repetition? And this is where tree banking comes in handy, because we're interested in looking at what syntax can tell us about this kind of thing. Can we use syntax to characterize authors? So essentially, what we have as a research question is an instance of author attribution. Now, and this kind of thing, of course, is much more reliably done by using a computer. There's a lot of advances. There are a lot of advances which have been made in the last several decades in computational author attribution. That is, using the computer to characterize and identify passages as written by one author or another. There's an extensive literature on this, and we have used this literature to dive into our research question. So essentially, what we are thinking is how to use treebank data in an authorship attribution study, especially given, for purposes that I won't go into, that we don't want to use the diction of Athenaeus to decide on authorship of individual passages, to put it bluntly and generally, because Athenaeus tends to choose passages that are about the same thing in his collections. He's topical, very topical, so we need to control for common subject matter and not accidentally attribute authorship based on common subject matter. So it seems to us that we can do that perhaps by focusing on other matters than vocabulary choice. And one of these things will be syntactic information as preserved in and represented in dependency tree banks. And what I'll present here will be the briefest possible overview of some of the approaches that we've taken to this question, to the question of can tree banks be used to isolate distinctive and distinguishing features among authors? Now, I guess to enter into this question, let's look very briefly at an example of a sentence and see what a tree bank might tell us. So here we have a little Xenophon, Hellenica, Mereditauta, Upolais Hemerais Husteron, Elthen ex Athenon, Thumocares, Echon Nausolagas. After a few days later, from Athens came Thymocares with a few ships. Now you can see here the dependencies indicated between the various parts of the sentence. It's a short sentence, and it's just here to illuminate what's going on. What's more interesting now is to look under the hood at the XML code, and here we see the same sentence. You see sentence ID, certain metadata giving us citation information, a kind of human legible reference, Xenophon Hellenica, Book 1, Sentence 1. And then we have each word as a node, an element in the XML code. And what we see here is that each word gives us a series of data categories that we can use for our analysis. We have word ID 1 through 15, so one of the things we can analyze is place of linear order. Where does the particular word occur with respect to all the other words in the sentence in the dimension of linear order? We also have a form character attribute. It tells us what form of the word is used. This is just the Greek word itself. Then the lemma. Lemma is a point of data. This would allow us, of course, to do analyses based on vocabulary in a quite neat way, because we already have a lemmatized text. Then the next bit of data here is the post tag, you see, which is what we might call part of speech tag. R stands for preposition, D for adverb, P for pronoun, in the plural neuter accusative, Pn dot Na, and so forth. Then we have the relation. This is the syntactic relation pertaining between the given word and the head of the word. We have a citation, bit of metadata here. Tells us this is the first word of the first sentence and so on, which we've added for purposes of debugging code. And then we have head. Head means what word is this particular word dependent on. In our syntax tree, what word does this particular word hang from, to use the jargon of the classroom. So these first two words, for example, hang from word number 8, which is elthon, the main verb of the sentence, and so forth. So anyway, from this slide, you get some idea of the kind of data that is produced when you annotate a sentence of Greek producing a dependency tree bank.